I think that if you're going to be a leader, you have to be willing to do your job, even if it's uncomfortable. And even if you're the only one who stands up in that situation and says, no, not going to do it. I remember being in a courtroom in Beaumont, Texas. And I was a relatively young lawyer. I was one of the few women in the courtroom. And the judge was notoriously difficult, but he was wrong about the law. And he was going to make a ruling that was going to be really, really detrimental to my client and wrong. So everyone else was terrified of him, and he makes this pronouncement, and I stood up and said, Your Honor, you can't do that. The rule says you can't do that. And he just looked at me, sort of like, who are you and why would you possibly say that? But to his credit, he listened to me and he did moderate his ruling.
Many people want to be leaders. Fewer understand what it really means to lead people well. So what separates the two? Welcome to the Lead with Purpose podcast with your host, Merv Jerset. Each week, you'll hear honest conversations with leaders who have been in the trenches and have stories to tell. They'll share their practical wisdom to help cut through the noise and get to the heart of leadership. So let's get started.
Hey, thanks for joining me on another episode of Lead with Purpose podcast. Sharla J. Frost joining me today. And let's see if I get this right, Sharla. Cattle rancher, accomplished lawyer, quasi-retired, a business author, and now a children's author. My head is spinning. So welcome. But before we get started on discussing essential leadership skills for today's leaders, can you give us a 2 to 3 minute overview of what I may have just botched of how Sharla Frost went from small town Oklahoma to a battle-tested high-stakes leader?
Well, thank you for having me today, Merv. And I'll do my best to put it all into 2 or 3 minutes. I am probably an example of adult ADD, as evidenced by the various things that I do. I grew up on a cattle ranch in Frogville, Oklahoma, which is in the southeastern corner of Oklahoma. It is the poorest county in all of Oklahoma, and Oklahoma is, of course, one of the poorest states. But I was really fortunate. I had great parents. I got a good education at the local school, which unfortunately just got graded an F on its academics. But, you make the best of where you are. And I was fortunate. I went from there to local college at Southeastern, which is known for Reba McEntire and Dennis Rodman. So those are our claims to fame. I like to think me, but, not quite so much yet. Then I was a debater in college. I went to law school on a debate scholarship because as a college debater who's an English major, you're really not qualified to get a job doing anything. So I had to go to law school to find something to do. And I thought I wanted to be a trial lawyer, and as it turned out, I did. I spent the better part of 40 years defending corporate clients in litigation all around the country. And I guess I got to do a lot of what I did because I would always say yes when the phone rang and then figure it out later. Then just before the pandemic hit, I decided, I've done this long enough. It's time to do something different. And my timing worked out perfectly. The world shut down, and I had time to write that business book I wished I'd always had when I was figuring out how to develop business. And since I was an old, used-up English major, I thought, I've always thought I might write a fantasy book. So 7 books later, the kids got to go back home to fictional Frogville, and I'm now finished with the Frogville Quest series. So I'm not sure what's next, but it's been fun.
And that Frogville Quest series, is that 7 books? Is that what I saw?
7 books, yeah.
I've got a couple of them, but I have to go back and get the rest because I've got an 8-year-old grandson that can probably benefit from your wisdom.
Well, and the books are fun.
Yeah.
They are traditional fairy tales, and they're designed to teach positive messages. My protagonist is a girl, which seemed reasonable for me.
Yeah.
And she's neither a victim nor a crusader. She's just a good, solid kid trying to figure out life. So I think the books were great for children of that age.
Well, I think you and I, just to, full disclosure to our audience, you and I belong to the same mastermind, and we've connected well through the last couple of years that we've been in that mastermind. But I found there's a lot of similarities between your background and mine. Not that I'm a lawyer, because I'm not, but I grew up not in Frogville, but in Minnetonus,
Small
which is,
town America is always a great place to start.
yeah, and in my case, it was small town Canada, but nonetheless, it was that rural upbringing, and I think some of that, maybe we'll get into this a little later. I think some of that rural upbringing, hard work on cattle farms, on ranches, I think that helps build that resilience and some of those leadership skills that come into vogue later on.
I tell people that you learn early if you live in the country that the cows have to be fed whether you want to do it or not, whether the weather is good, whether you have the money. The things that are important come first, and everything else follows along behind.
Yeah, and we had a few dairy cows, so there was no getting away from those morning milk times.
No,
So
yeah, fortunately, mine were all free-range beef cattle, so
there you
no
go.
no milking involved, but your basic premise, I think, is correct.
Yeah.
You learn life skills that apply no matter what you're doing.
So when you go back over that storied career, thank you. You put that very succinctly for us. But when you go back over that, what do you think were some of the key leadership, I'll call them moments in that journey that helped you along your journey?
Well, I would eh, credit some of my mentors, and they were early mentors. My high school principal, my senior year in high school, I was planning to be a secretary. You know,
Mm,
my favorite aunt was a secretary. My, high school counselor's favorite sister was a secretary. I was gonna be a secretary, and this guy shows up and does an evaluation of all the kids in the school, all 200 of us at the time, by the way, and he had read through everyone's file. He sat me down and said, "What are you gonna do in life?" And I said, "I'm gonna be a secretary." And he said, "No, you're gonna have a secretary." So we revisited that about 6 months later, and we had the same, discussion, and he said again, "What are you gonna do?" And I said, "I thought we had this discussion. I'm gonna be a secretary." And it's like, "No, you're not." So I credit him with getting me focused on and moving towards law school, which actually worked well for me. I like people. I enjoy the interaction and the intellectual challenge that comes from legal issues. And I never knew that I had the ability to refuse an assignment,
ah,
and that makes a difference.
yeah,
When my clients needed me, and it's still the case, when my clients need me, my job is to figure out how to help them. And I think that makes a difference. And I tried to instill that in the people who worked for me. One part that I left out of the biography was that for many years, I was partners in a law firm in Houston. Powers and Frost. My friend Jim Powers, my long-term business partner, and I had a what you call a boutique litigation firm. All
uh,
we really did was trials, and we represented big clients, Fortune 50 clients around the country, and we trained lots of young lawyers. Just before the tort reform in Texas, which I describe as being like Sherman going through Atlanta as it related to litigation. We were up to 50 lawyers and we had almost 100 staff people. So, in addition to doing legal work, I had to learn how to operate a business and run a business. And it goes back to those cattle ranching days. You do what you need to do and you learn what you need to learn. But I was fortunate to have great people who worked for me and we trained them. We spent time with them. You talk about strategy and you talk about how best to accomplish things that are in the benefit of your client, whether they're to your benefit or not. And
yeah.
I think that that's what I would credit with putting me in a position to be successful in the industry. And I was lucky, I was successful. I was president of Litigation Council of America, which was great. It's a national bar. I was voted by my peers, and that's a big deal. Lawyers, uh, we may like each other, unusual to kind of vote for each other, but they voted me the best defense lawyer in Houston in 2018 for products liability work. And there are thousands of people that do that work. So I was very honored and humbled that my peers thought that of me. It was unexpected, but I think that it will give you and your listeners an idea of the level to which I played in the legal business.
Well, and not only that, it strikes me, you said what, 50 litigators and 100 staff?
Yeah.
If your experience is anything like my experience, and I'm people who have been listening to my podcast know that I come from the IT systems development, systems project leadership ranks. If your experience is anything like mine, your college degree may have given you the basics, but did not prepare you for leadership.
Oh, it didn't prepare me for leadership at all. You've got to remember, I was an English and speech double major.
There you
I was
go.
qualified to maybe take orders at McDonald's. I could think, I could speak, but I didn't have any job skills. So I had to really learn how to do all of that on the fly. And I certainly didn't have any business training. I always suggest to students that I talk to that whatever your major is, I don't care if you're a music major, take a couple of basic business classes because I didn't do that. So I vividly remember the first delivery of the information about payroll and taxes because even though we were lawyers, we did a few things right at the beginning. And one of them was we hired an outside payroll service because we
Mm.
knew neither of us really were skilled in that issue. And Jim was my rock star at the beginning. He was a very well-known, well-recognized trial lawyer, and I wasn't. I was young. I was a lot younger than him, and I was running the office, answering the phone and making sure he got to the courtroom, and I was supposed to do all the administrative stuff. So I get that first report. And in those days, they delivered it to you in a big envelope. It
Mm.
came from a delivery kid. Shows up big envelope. I pull it out, and I remember looking at it and going, "I wonder if it goes this way or this way." It was a bar graph. I didn't have clue one what it meant, but we ran the business off my credit card for the first 6 months, and I learned how to read bar graphs. And over time, those calls about trials came to me as well. But you have to learn how to do it, and
Yeah.
I didn't know at the beginning.
Well, you kind of hit on a couple things that are technical or process oriented or mechanical in terms of running a business, but there must have been some leadership muscles that you had to develop or build that your law school never prepared you for just in working with what, 50 litigators and 100 staff. I mean, that takes a certain kind of leader to keep those people marching in the same direction that you want them to march.
You do, and uh, managing lawyers in some ways is like herding cats. But I learned fairly quickly you have a different set of issues with your professional staff than your lay staff. I'll call them non-professional, and I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, but your lawyers are one set. You've got to keep them focused. You've got to make sure they're where they're supposed to be. They're doing their reports. They're doing all the stuff they're supposed to be doing. And then you have all your support people, and they need to be there every day, and they need to know what they need to do. And we had uh, a very detailed set of instructions because we had a lot of paralegal support, and they were terrific, but they all needed to do things the same way.
Yeah.
So systematizing the work we were doing because it was volume work was really important. So we wrote out protocols. If this document comes in, it's supposed to go to Susie, and Susie's supposed to input the information in this way and describe it in this way. So we did things in a way that made things standardized. And it made sense that that was the way to do it, but it took some trial and error,
Yeah.
and it took refinement. So had we known people like you at the time, it would have been much more helpful. But we also brought in some consultants. We had a set of business consultants come in when we were much smaller. We at that time, I think we had 8 lawyers and maybe a dozen staff people, but it was clear that we needed some systems and we needed uh, not rules so much, but we needed procedures. And they came in and evaluated everything for us and said, this works really well. This really sucks. You need to do it differently.
Yeah.
But they were very helpful. And we made a point of reaching out to professionals who did the sorts of things we didn't know how to do.
Which is a huge leadership characteristic or trait in the fact that you have to admit that you don't know everything and can't do everything, right?
Yeah. Well,
So
and you just have to do that because no one is capable of doing it all,
yeah.
and we traveled a lot, we were out a lot, we had great people, but we needed to be comfortable that they understood how to do things the way we wanted them done.
Yeah. Let me kind of switch a little bit to maybe the courtroom, but I want to use the courtroom as kind of your building block to my audience in terms of how some of these leadership traits look like in action. And I want to look at, say, decision making. And in your case, as a lawyer, I imagine there's decision making under pressure. Much like in my case, running huge projects, there was decision making under pressure. So when everything is on the line, Charla, what does leadership look like in those final hours before walking into court and there's a huge item on the line?
Preparation. Before you get to the courtroom, you better be prepared. You should know your case. You should know your judge because the same case in front of a different judge can be a very, very different thing. And you need to have thought through what the potentials are. You can't predict everything, but if you understand your case and what you're fighting about, you can predict most of it. And you have to be prepared to make a decision.
Yeah,
They talk about paralysis by analysis or analysis by paralysis,
yeah,
however that works.
yeah, yeah.
It's a little different in the legal field, but not by a lot. And you have to be willing to make the decision. And sometimes you have to be willing to make the hard call. I remember being in a courtroom in Beaumont, Texas. And I was a relatively young lawyer. I was one of the few women in the courtroom. But given the work that I did, I was often one of few women, never rarely the only, but often one of few. And the judge was notoriously difficult, but he was wrong about the law. And he was going to make a ruling that was going to be really, really detrimental to my client and wrong. So everyone else was terrified of him, and he makes this pronouncement, and I stood up and said, Your Honor, you can't do that. The rule says you can't do that. And he just looked at me, sort of like, who are you and why would you possibly say that? But to his credit, he listened to me and he did moderate his ruling. Didn't completely change it, but he
Right,
did moderate it. And
right.
one of the older lawyers came to me sometime later and he said, I've said this to others, so I really need to say it to you. You are braver than I am. And I was very impressed with what you did. And I was like, well, that's my job.
Yeah.
And I think that if you're going to be a leader, you have to be willing to do your job, even if it's uncomfortable. And even if you're the only one who stands up in that situation and says, no, not going to do it.
Even in IT, we had something very similar, and that was sometimes people would analysis because we're great analysts. That's how we're brought up, right? And we'd end up in that analysis paralysis, and the saying we would often have is, "Not to make a decision is really to make a decision."
And it is because not making a decision means that the outcome is probably preordained.
Yeah.
but I always thought it was my job to do what I needed to do, even if it was uncomfortable, and it was often uncomfortable. I was in courtroom. I tried a case in rural Mississippi.
Oh.
It was Port Gibson, Mississippi, south of Vicksburg. And, I'm not from there. The people are lovely, but they want someone that's from there.
Mm.
That wasn't me. The judge was difficult, uh, didn't like women, didn't like out-of-towners. I was both of those, but,
Yeah.
that yeah, I always told my young lawyers, "Everyone has something to deal with." For me, it was that I was female. I had one guy who was a little bitty short guy. Short guys have short things to deal with. One of my guys was a great big tall guy, and people were jealous of him when he walked in the courtroom. He dealt with a different set of issues. If you're going to be successful, you have to identify your issue and learn to deal with it,
Yeah.
whatever it is.
I thought
And
when you
and
start
I told people that.
I thought when you started on the, Mississippi thing that you're gonna go into a John Grisham type of expose or something.
Yeah,
So,
that's a story for a different day.
yeah.
Yeah,
But, yeah, I again, as a lawyer, and in my case as a IT, and for my listeners who are leaders in their own right, I sense that power of persuasion is one of those leadership skills we all should continue to hone throughout our entire careers. What do you think?
it is. And for me, the debate experience in college was really crucial for that because we had to learn to argue both sides of the issue.
Mm,
In one round, you're for it, in the next round, you're against it. And you have to learn to be objective and you have to learn to advocate and understand what your position is.
yeah.
But again, that goes back to preparation too. You need to understand and have conquered the information that you're dealing with. And if you do that, then you're in a position to advocate because you know what the strengths are and you know what the weaknesses are.
Yeah.
But if you're going to be a good advocate, you have to be prepared. You have to have gone through it all, thought through it. And something that I've always found useful is you have to have practiced it. There's
Oh, yeah.
something about articulating it
Yeah.
and then sleeping on it. One of my jury consultants, who was a PhD in, I think, anthropology, one of the ologies, but she always suggested that you practice it, you speak it, you think about it, and then you sleep on it because she says there's something magic that happens when you sleep.
Yeah.
Those things become encoded for you IT people. They are in your brain in a different way, and there's a lot of truth to that.
I need to play this last 2 minutes for my wife because she thinks when I do that, I'm just procrastinating. So, hey, before I get into your book, because that, your books, your children's books, because that's a huge pivot. But I have a question for you that, lawyers sometimes have a bad rap in regard to integrity and ethics. And I know you as a hugely integrous person. But what makes someone trustworthy, especially when the stakes are high, and especially when you're fighting that kind of age-old incorrectness about lawyers?
Well, something that I find, and a very good friend of mine who's not a lawyer says that he just cannot understand how it is that lawyers can be adversaries but still be friends,
Yeah.
because that's contrary to the way that the public at large deals with things. You're either for me or against me. And that's really your job as a lawyer is to advocate for your client's position and to be prepared and to do it honestly and in accordance with the law. But next week, you may be on the other side of that, and your position may be contrary to that. So, from my perspective, a great deal of what is perceived as not being reliable amongst lawyers is that disconnect between what your job is as a lawyer and what your training is, and how the general public deals with things. having said that, there's some people out there who just aren't honest, and that's no different in the legal profession than it is
Yeah.
in any other profession.
Anywhere. Yeah.
But you learn to do things in accordance with the rules, and if you follow the rules, the ethical rules, sometimes that means your client's not gonna be happy. I had I had a famous client from a different country, not from Canada, but, from different country, and he had a dispute, and it was a really ugly piece of litigation. It was potentially big dollars and could have bankrupted his company.
Mm.
And he kept calling me and saying, "Call the judge. Tell the judge this. Tell him I'll pay him this," because that's how it worked in his country. And I had to explain to him every time he called, I can't do that. That's contrary to the rules in this country.
Yeah.
So you really, from an ethics standpoint, you have to know what the rules are and play by the rules, but the perception of that won't always be positive for the lawyer.
And I often tell my lawyer friends, I have several here in Albuquerque where I live, that our TV sitcoms or our TV shows don't help that
Oh,
that process.
no. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I never watch the lawyer shows. They drive me absolutely crazy. They get nothing right.
Right.
So, yeah, they are not helpful. Yeah.
So, I think the last time you and I talked, I think I understood that you're back in the ranch in Frogville or that area or something, that you spend some time there as well?
I do. I split my time between my home in Houston and my ranch property in Oklahoma. I bought ranch property not long after I got out of law school and built a house here a little over 20 years ago. And that worked out beautifully during COVID because I
Yeah.
was able to come to the ranch and not have to worry about 6 feet separation. There's not anybody in a quarter of a mile of me here. So all of that was good. But I spend a lot of time at the ranch in Oklahoma.
So having, retired essentially from the courtroom work and going on to you're now speaking, ranching, obviously. Apparently you're involved in a local nonprofit, but here's what I'm really interested in. Somehow in all of that, you pivoted to authoring a children's series. We already mentioned that a series of 7 Frogville books. So for my audience, that may include leaders, by the way, who feel like they're done with their careers and they want to go on to something else. What do you think is one of the first honest questions they need to ask themselves before making that pivot to not retiring into an easy chair, but retiring to something meaningful like you did?
Yeah. I was ready to be finished in the courtroom, so that was an easy decision for
Yeah.
me. But I made sure that I did it logically. I had decided I was ready to be done, and the firm that I was associated with at the time had this fabulous provision in the partnership agreement that I discovered during a partners meeting while listening to an endless discussion about a comma. But it had a provision that once you turned 58, you could give them 30 days notice and retire. And they had to give you back your capital account, which, for those of you who are not lawyers, that's the investment that you make to become a partner, and the firm
Right.
holds that. That's sort of like your long-term investment. So I had decided that's what I wanted to do, and I spent a year positioning myself. I transferred work, I finished up client responsibilities. I did a lot of things to put the building blocks in place, and I would suggest to anyone who's thinking about making that kind of career change that you do that. It's not the you wake up and go, "Okay, I'm done," and walk out the next day.
Yeah.
You really do need to do some preparation, and I knew I was not going to be happy doing nothing. That's just not my personality. So I gave a lot of thought to what I wanted to do, and what I really wanted to do was write a book about marketing and business development for women lawyers specifically, because I did a tremendous amount of business development for my firm, and I was good at it, but it was trial and error. and it would have been more effective and not quite so painful over time if I had had some resources to use, and there just really wasn't anything out there. So, uh, I was gonna write that, I was gonna use it to do some speaking, I was gonna do some training, and then COVID hit, and of course, all of that was done. So I published right into the pandemic, and that was kind of a waste of time, but it was useful, and the information was useful, and people still take advantage of it. But after having done that, I sat down with the publisher, and he said, "What do you think about the process?" And I said, "Well, I'd always thought I could write a book. A little harder than I thought, took a little
Yeah.
bit more time than I expected, but I kind of enjoyed it." And he said, "Well, the only thing that's selling right now are children's books because kids are locked up at home and they have nothing to do, and parents want something for them. So, would you be interested in writing a children's book?" And I said, "I don't have kids." "Sure, I'll give it a try." Um, as a child, I always enjoyed lit children's literature and fantasy, things like Alice in Wonderland,
Mhm.
not the picture book kind of stuff. And so the first book is truly a fairy tale, and that when I got to the end of that one, it's like, I kind of enjoyed that.
Yeah.
And then I started thinking about what do you do in the process, and writing something that was uplifting was something I wanted to do because while I don't have children, I have lots of little cousins and things like that. And having read a bunch of contemporary children's literature, I find it to be very dark. And I really wanted to add something that was uplifting to contemporary children's literature. So, 7 installments later, the kids get to go back home. But for those of you who are thinking about what you're gonna do next, I think it's important to identify something that really resonates with you, whether it's pro bono work or it's volunteer work or going back to school or changing to a different kind of business. You're not going to be satisfied if you've been busy for your professional life to just go home and sit. Television's not that
Oh,
interesting.
it's 200 channels, and it's worse than it was when we had 6 channels.
Exactly. When they say 500 channels and nothing's on, they
Yeah,
really mean it. There's just not
really mean
anything
it.
worthwhile. But it's important to identify something that resonates with you and to do it in a meaningful way. The mastermind has been terrific. I really wish I had discovered the mastermind universe
Mm,
probably 10 or 15 years ago. I'm at a stage in my life where I'm really not interested in still spending 300 nights a year on the road,
yeah.
whether that's for trials like I did for years or if it's for speaking. I want to do it in moderation. But that process has been fascinating. And I told someone the other day, I've spent a great deal of time in the last 5 years becoming someone different, becoming someone new. And for those who are thinking about whether to retire and what they're going to do in retirement, I think that it's important to identify those things you would like to do and then find a way to do them,
Yeah.
not to just think about them. Join a group, join a mastermind, find some group that's doing what you're interested in, and see what you think. But that too is a leadership issue, I think, because you have to be willing to put yourself out there and say, "I don't know how to do this." And there have been a tremendous number of things over the last 5 years that I really don't know how to do,
Yeah,
but I'm learning.
you're learning, yeah. What struck me when you were, recounting that is that as a lawyer, as an IT person, what makes us effective in our leadership is our ability to tell stories. And so when you retired, the fact that you changed your audience from juries to children, you still use that incredible, I think, one of the most important leadership skills, and that of storytelling.
Communication is the key,
Yeah.
and you are absolutely correct. I tell people that while I'm applying my skills in a different way, they're still the same skills. If I can explain to a jury in Southern Mississippi why my client who made asbestos-containing products shouldn't have to pay for someone who we do not believe has a disease related to that.
Yeah.
That that is storytelling at its best, but it's backed up by facts.
Sure.
For children's books, the storytelling is different, but I did a lot of research on that. My children's books, each of them come from a different literary tradition. So the first one's really a traditional fairy tale. The second one is Arabian Nights. I went back and reread the Arabian Nights so that, I had the right flavor for that. The third one is more of Irish fairy tales,
Hmm.
and I did a bunch of research on Irish fairy tales. The fourth one is Norse mythology. So I pulled all the Norse mythology that I read when I was in 4th grade and reread it to make sure that I got the references right. And those research skills go into the work that I'm doing, irrespective of the sort of the genre that it falls in.
Well, so storytelling, but again, and I'm going to put this out there for people who are listening, creativity to
Yes,
develop that creative impulse. And in your case, it took research that you then fostered into a creative approach. Or maybe it's the creative approach that got you to do the research that then got you. But creativity, I think, is a huge spark for people who want to lead teams and want to lead their clients.
I think creativity is what distinguishes the successful from the non-successful,
Yeah.
and that's true of whatever field it is that you're in,
Yeah.
because anyone can follow the list.
Yeah.
But taking the list and visualizing how it could be better or different or doesn't apply at all takes a different skill set, and it takes that willingness to be brave.
Yeah.
Bravery is part of it. You have to be able to stand up in that courtroom and say, "Here, you judge, you can't do that."
You can't do that. Absolutely. I remember a very distinct fact, I just signed a book to someone who I worked with years ago, and I remember him coming in. It was a go, no go decision as to whether we should go live with this huge system, statewide, whether we should go live. And one by one, his advisor says, yeah, yeah, yeah. And he came to me and I said, no.
Right.
And I told him all of the reasons I felt that we should not go live, but the biggest story was how it would impact his 10,000 workers out in the field. And, one lone voice, and we did not go for another 6 or 7 months until we could kind of clean things up a little bit. But, yeah, it takes courage. It really does to be able to stand up against what
Right.
everyone else is saying.
And courage isn't always popularity. And
No.
those are 2 very different things. I did some pro bono work, after I retired, some legal work for a small community, and some of the information that I had to give them was not well received.
No.
But it was the right information, and it was my obligation to tell them the truth, whether they wanted to hear it or not. And that can be a tough situation. But if you're going to lead, whatever your organization is or whatever your field is, you just have to be able to do that.
Well, imagine if you told them what they wanted to hear and it was wrong.
Oh, and what they wanted to hear was definitely wrong. It
Definitely
was it
wrong.
was it was going to be a much worse outcome than having them angry at me for not having told them what they wanted to hear.
Yeah.
Uh, the long-term implications of making people happy, is different than the long-term implication of doing what you need
Oh,
to do.
huge, yeah. So I like to end, my podcast with some rapid fire questions to see, just to get a little more idea as to who you are, who I am, what the
Okay.
lesson is all about. So, what is from your perspective? And again, I'm talking to you as a lawyer, but this applies to my listeners, no matter what occupation or avocation they're in. But what do you think one lesson from the courtroom that you learned that every leader that's listening to us today should steal immediately?
Always carry the rules with you.
Ah,
I was in a courtroom in New York. I was the only lawyer in the courtroom who had the rule book with me, and there was an issue that came up. Somebody asked the question. The whole room went silent, and I was like, "Excuse me, Rule 75."
perfect, perfect. All right, second question. Which of your Frogville characters do you think is the most like you and why?
Oh, I'm sure that that's Lily. Lily Pad Lotus Dillweed, who is my protagonist, is the main character, and she's always looking for a way to fix the problem and keep
Yeah,
moving.
cool. By the way, my oldest granddaughter is Lily, so maybe I need to buy these for her.
You do. She needs a whole set.
Yeah. Hey, what's a leadership myth that you hope we can finally retire in any industry, in all of our industries? A leadership myth that we could finally retire.
Oh, that leaders are born, not made.
That's mine as
Hate
well.
that one. Hate that one. People learn skills. Some people may be predisposed to be loud or impressive, but that doesn't make them a leader.
Yeah. When I wrote my book on leadership, I call it Lead Smarter, Not Harder. I put a whole section in on all of these leadership myths, and that's the first one.
Yeah.
Leaders are not born. Leaders can develop those skills.
Right.
All right, I'm going to give you one more.
Okay.
Finish this sentence, Sharla. Great leadership always starts with blank.
Preparation.
You said that before, right?
Yeah. 'Cause I
Perfect.
do believe it's true,
Yeah.
whether you're talking about learning how to read that bar chart report,
Yeah.
uh, or learning how to train your young lawyers to be service-oriented and fearless. It's all about preparation.
All about preparation. I wish I had your insight when I was first consulting on those large IT systems projects. And for my listeners, I really do encourage you to listen, maybe even go back over this podcast and grab 2 or 3 items from what Charla helped us with today and see if you can't apply those immediately in your leadership journey and see where you go from there. So, Charlotte, tell our audience where they can find you. Should they want to read your books or write their own book or engage your services or just to connect, where can they find you?
I'm on LinkedIn, so you can find me there. It's Sharla J. Frost, and that Sharla with an S. Some people spell it with a C.
See.
Or
Yeah.
you may find me at my website, sharlafrost.com, or my speaker website, which is sharlajfrostspeaker.com, because I kind of separate the two. My book series is the Frogville Quest series, currently running on a Black Friday special. And then my business books, which we didn't really talk about, is the Power at the Table series. And there is both the first one for women lawyers, one for non-gender specific lawyers, which is the second one. And then early next year, we will be publishing the third and final one in that series, which is for entrepreneurs. So Power at the Table 3 yet to come.
Well, and Charla, I know that you and I will be sitting at the same table in March of next
Mhm.
year. So that's going to be, how's this duo power at the table?
Exactly. Yeah.
Hey, I appreciate you so much. And we're going to sign off now. But again,
All right.
thanks.
Thank
And we'll
Yeah.
talk to you.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you to your audience for listening.
You bet.
If today's conversation added value, make sure you subscribe. And if this episode resonated, please leave a quick review to help other leaders discover the show. And remember, leadership works best when you put people first. Let's lead with purpose, together.